This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, it is another of my film series about why this film is great. The subject this time is Lindsay Anderson's first film, This Sporting Life, and I'll be speaking with David Forrest about it, and the conversation will begin in a moment. David Forrest is my guest, and he will be speaking with me about why the film This Sporting Life is a great film. It's an almost 60-year-old film, and the first by British filmmaker Lindsay Anderson. It starred Richard Harris, and it was a very typical, if not a great example of the kitchen sink realism of that day. We'll talk about that as well. But David, before we get into all of that, if I could ask you, give a little bit of background about yourself and your interest in both the film and the book that preceded it.
Well, thanks, Dan. Yeah, my name's David Forrest. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Sheffield in Yorkshire, in the north of England. And I have I suppose, a set of research interests and areas of expertise which really focus on representations of the north of England, particularly, and on cinematic and literary realism, and particularly narratives that are focused on working class communities in those areas and those parts of the country. And so This Sporting Life is a film that has been a huge part of my research. In fact, my PhD thesis, which was completed over a decade ago now, was spent a substantial amount of time on This Sporting Life. And then the book project before last that I undertook was on a film which is quite similar in some ways to The Sporting Life, Kes, which is directed by Ken Loach in 1969. And working on that project and exploring the archive of that project brought me back to This Sporting Life, actually. So recently I've been encountering the archive held at the University of York of David Storey, who is the author of This Sporting Life. And I've been trying to develop some new perspectives on the film and on the novel that preceded it. So I'm really interested in it from all sorts of perspectives, but particularly I think its representation of class and masculinity. I'm also interested in how sport operates in the film, and I'm also interested in how the film communicates a sense of place. And those are the things that really engage me. Maybe sort of 10, 12 years ago, my interest in it was as an example of the British New Wave, is in the kitchen sink cycle that you talked about, Dan, as well. So I think that's also a really interesting angle for us to explore.
You mentioned Kes. I remember seeing that about 10 or 12 years ago when it came out on Criterion. I forget the particulars of it. Was that the one, is it a bird, that it has a bird in it or something?
Yeah, that's right. It's about a boy in a small industrial town called Barnsley, who is pretty down on his luck and doesn't really have much going for him until he meets this kestrel, this bird, bird of prey, and he trains it and develops a nurturing relationship with it, and it kind of hints at the potential that he might go on and experience in his life. And it was there's a lot of similarities with This Sporting Life in the sense that Barnsley is about 10, 12 miles away from the area of that David Storey's from, near the city of Wakefield. It's also a coal mining community. Like Barry Hines, the writer of Kes, David Storey, the writer of This Sporting Life, was the son of a coal miner who, and this is one of the really interesting things about This Sporting Life, I think, who left his working class community via grammar school, via education. And in many ways, This Sporting Life, I think, is interested in what happens when you leave the security of one community and into the more liminal space that sits between other communities, other social classes, other kind of realms of work and community. So there are lots of interesting similarities between the two, and geographically, as I say, they're not far from each other.
Well, let's sort of work from the broad to the general. Let's talk about kitchen sink realism for a moment. As someone, I've always enjoyed Italian neorealism, and then there was the French New Wave, the Japanese New Wave. How does kitchen sink realism fit in with those other forms that are trying to deal with somehow realism?
So I think there's a lot of I think we need to think about the broader kind of ecosystem of British realism. So in the 1930s, I suppose we're seeing a lot of in the late 1920s through state-sponsored documentaries. That's really the site of realist cinema in Britain. So it's not necessarily fiction cinema, not necessarily mainstream commercial cinema. Instead, it is in sort of state or state-sponsored documentaries, and the Grierson school of documentary. Also, documentary makers like Humphrey Jennings, for example. So it's where we see that's where realism is located. And by realism, I mean the use of real locations, but I also mean a representation of social classes and of kind of geographical regions outside of the mainstream. So it's realism in terms of its coverage and in terms of its verisimilitude. So that's the 1930s, and we see that. And through wartime, we see realism embedded within fiction filmmaking because of the propaganda, the necessities, really, to tell authentic stories that represented the nation as the sum of its parts during wartime. And as we see cinema developing a kind of social function on a mass scale during wartime. And then we see a kind of return, and this is quite a potted history, but it is a bit of a return to a sort of more politically conservative and narrow view of mainstream cinema, and that coincides with the development of, as you say, Italian neorealism, French New Wave, also Japanese cinema, and those films being seen in film clubs associated with the universities, etc., and still this underlying tradition of documentary filmmaking that's going on. So you've got documentary filmmaking converging with this cinephile culture that's coming over from Europe. And I think as a result of that alchemy, you begin to see filmmakers like Tony Richardson, like David Story, like Carol Rice coming to the fore. Now, the other area to throw into the mix is that we're seeing in literature and in theatre a real focus on the working class, on this generation of grammar school educated working class writers who were, as I said at the outset, kind of divorced from their social moorings in working class communities as a result of their education. And those writers were occupying this new space of middle class cultural life. But they didn't feel particularly comfortable in that life, nor in the life that they'd left. And so that tension is something that's also at the heart of these texts. And those directors worked with those writers, developed partnerships. One such partnership is Lindsay Anderson and David Story. So as you can see, there's that real range of influences that I think produce something which is quite unique, and often the new wave is seen as an attempt to emulate the European new waves. I think actually, and is seen in quite a pejorative sense as not being as artistically valid because of its reliance on adaptation, for example. And a lot of the critiques at the time emerged from that view. But I would say that actually, if we take into account that range of influences and that quite unique convergence of influences, we need to look again at it. And I think it's quite a unique cycle. But really, it died in the mid-1960s. This Sport in Life is probably the last example, really, of that. And perhaps Billy Liar as well, directed by John Schlesinger, whose work I'm sure you're familiar with. And the view is that the northern working class black and white films were kind of replaced by the colour swinging 60s of London in the middle of that decade and that period. So it's short-lived. It's around 1958 to 1963.
Would an apt analogy be, and I'm not certain about the setup of the television industry, but I know, having seen documentaries made on ITV versus the BBC, there seemed to have been a divergence in what they focused on in ITV, which seemed to be smaller, independent, more like documentary versions of what you're talking about, small town life, whereas the BBC was more national, more global.
Well, in ITV was responsible in the mid-1960s for Coronation Street, which was a soap opera which still runs to this day, which was defined by its focus on working class northern communities. It was set just outside of Manchester, in an area called Salford, and it's that area that also Sheila Delaney writes from in her film A Taste of Honey, which is another example of made with Tony Richardson, which is another example for the British New Wave. So yeah, ITV was important, I think, but also the BBC later on actually does create a bit of a space for realism in the mid-1960s with the development of the Wednesday play. But in a way, realism moved to television from cinema during the second half of the 1960s. And so actually that's when the BBC does take on a greater role. But yeah, there is an interesting symbiosis, I think, between television culture in Britain and cinematic culture. And someone like Ken Loach operates within those spaces. David Story as well operates within those spaces as someone who wrote television drama as well as films.
Well, let's start with now David Story and the novel that This Sporting Life was based on. Story himself had played professional rugby, I believe, or at least semi-pro. What is his background, and was that his first book, This Sporting Life?
Well, he has a fascinating background. So this is a son of a coal miner who grows up on a large council estate so a bit like a housing project, I suppose. If I was to find a US context, just outside of a city called Wakefield, and that these mining communities are very close knit in the sense that most of the people are employed in some way, either directly or indirectly, by the coal mine. So there is a set of values there which are enshrined, I suppose, through different institutions, but the coal mine, the church as well, to a lesser extent. And he's growing up in this working class community, but he also goes to grammar school. So he passes the 11 plus examination. So the 11 plus examination was an exam that was taken by children at the age of 11, and if they passed it, they were able to go to grammar school. So grammar school was a school that focused on academic education as opposed to vocational education. This meant that if you didn't get to grammar school, you would have a technical education which prepared you for a career in the manual working classes. If you went to grammar school, you were expected then to go on to university, to college, to develop a career in the professions. So this was quite transformative in Britain in the 1950s because it meant that people who previously been contained within their classes because of their education were able to be more socially mobile. So Story passes the 11 plus, and he is at Wakefield Grammar School. And at Wakefield Grammar School, he performs very well in his education, but he's also quite a resistant, quite a rebellious person. He takes on a number of jobs before going to university. He works as a contractor, which inspired one of his plays, The Contractor, which was on Broadway for a number of years. He building tents for weddings, which also ended up in one of his novels, Radcliffe. He also was a bus conductor as a teenager. So he's kind of doing these jobs as well, at the same time as developing a deep passion for writing, but also this time for art, visual art, for painting. And so he's also a very talented sportsman. So already we're starting to see that there's a lot going on here. We've got someone who's from a working class background in this very tight-knit, homogenised identity, but he's developing a taste for culture, for the arts, but he's also a very talented athlete. So this physical realm is something which is explored. And this is quite new. These convergent identities, we don't really have a way of imagining them in 1950s and 1960s Britain. People exist in boxes, let's say, in quite narrow, quite rigid identity clusters, but Story's breaking out of those. And so he goes to university, he goes to the Slade School of Fine Art. He's surrounded there by people who aren't in his social class. And he is initially very successful. He goes back at the weekend, though, to play professional rugby league for Wakefield Trinity. His dad is immensely proud of him for playing rugby league, for signing up. because that is the value system that his dad, from a working class background as a coal miner, sees. He doesn't value Story's aspirations to being an artist because he doesn't understand those. So Story is in London in the week, and then he travels up for training and for games back to Wakefield on the train. And so he's constantly oscillating between these two places, neither of which does he feel comfortable. And that really defines him and the tensions. And let's say this book, actually, it's called A Stinging Delight by David Story. It's his memoir. It's just come out posthumously because it's so, I think, it has so much honesty in it and reveals so much about the depression, really, that he felt as a result of those relationships, as a result of those challenges that he faced between those two spaces. And so he leaves the Slade School of Fine Art. He feels disaffected with art. He marries Barbara, his childhood sweetheart. He becomes a school teacher, and as a school teacher in London, in very, very challenging schools, he begins writing this Sporting Life, and it's his first novel. It's rejected on numerous occasions, and finally it is accepted, and the rest is history. Things happen very quickly after that.
So let's talk, if you can just give us a brief précis of the book. I know that the main character's name is changed in the film from. Are there any major changes from the book to the film that we should be aware of as we head into the film here?
Not really that affect the outcome of the film, but there's a bit more texture in the book. As you say, interestingly, he's called Arthur in the novel. The reason for that is that when the film adaptation came out, they had to differentiate Arthur from Arthur Seaton, who is the star of the central character in Albert Finney's film Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, directed by Cara Rice, which was the kind of definitive British New Wave film from 1960. So to differentiate, they changed him to Frank Machin. We see more of his family. So we see there's actually scenes involving him returning to his family, which is significant. So Frank returning to or Arthur in the novel returning to his father and his mother, having a difficult relationship with them. There's also Morris, his close friend in the film. We also learn more of his life. He gets a younger woman pregnant. There's a lot of scandal there. There's the assumption that that's Frank. Actually, it's Morris. So there's a bit more there, and there's a bit more of an exploration of his, I suppose, relationship with consumerism, the way that he spends money and enjoys, albeit superficially, some of the luxuries of his short-lived fame and commercial success. But really, the novel is tracing the trajectory that the film sets out.
So, David, let's sort of go through some of the major themes and narrative of the film. One of the things that I found interesting about the film was that given that kitchen sink is a term used for realism, the film opens with what could be almost a dream sequence, because the main character has been knocked out or totally injured, and he's being helped into a dental office, and he's put under sedation, and it brings up the idea of can we really trust what happens in the bulk of the film to be real, or is it his idealized version? I'm only bringing this up because my wife was talking with a friend of hers about the movie Joker that came out, and I haven't seen it because a lot of people have told me it's just third-rate Scorsese. But in that movie, the Joker apparently has a whole relationship with a neighbor of his that turns out to be his psychotic delusion or something. So I'm wondering if here 60 years earlier or so, can we really trust that this up and down relationship that he has with this I forget whether she's a widow or a widow rather, or a divorce. I think she's a widow. How much of that is real? It's an interesting start to a realist film.
So I agree, and I think I would say embrace the ambiguity. I would say that one of the interesting things to note is that apart from one scene, which again could be Frank's imagination himself or a memory, Frank is in every single one of the scenes. So Mrs. Hammond appears in one with her children, but that could easily be Frank imagining that. So and the novel as well is written from the first person, and similarly has that kind of temporal discontinuity. So jumps around from time zone to time zone. So I think I would argue that the realism of the British New Wave, one of the things that defines it, is its rejection of kind of objective or surface realist aesthetics. So this Sport in Life is quite similar in many ways to. So the first thing we hear in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, 1960, is a voiceover, that subjective voiceover narration. The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner, which comes out the year before, contains numerous flashbacks, has moments of almost Truffaut-esque, but very reminiscent of the 400 Blows, moments of self-consciousness within it. Billy Liar, of course, in 1963, also released at the same time, also takes us into the character's imagination. So one of the things that's really revolutionary about the British New Wave is that it acknowledges the inner life of working class protagonists, whereas previously we'd seen the working class in British cinema and British culture as a homogenous mass. Here we're seeing characters like Frank, not as generic individuals, but as deeply fragmented, tortured people who for whom linear, logical memory association isn't necessarily applicable. So yeah, I think it's consciously ambiguous. And of course, as I said at the start, we're seeing here, I think, yes, the influence of I think I always think of Hiroshima Mon Amour in terms of its representation of memory. I think there's no doubt you can see from Lindsay Anderson's writings that he was interested in that kind of alinear approach to narrative that we were seeing in France, particularly at the time. But also, I would say that alinearity is something that's embraced by story. That doesn't stop it from being realism, but it takes us into a kind of psychological or subjective realism, which I think is what the film pursues.
But was the dentist office scene made for the film, or was that in the book, actually?
Yeah, it's in the book as well. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So also some of the other really powerful, more symbolic or figurative scenes that are in the book. So the moment where Frank stands at the top of the hill, looking down upon the city, that's described vividly in the book as well. So that there is, and stories very faithful in rendering the key moments from the book, and Anderson and sort of taking them to the screen.
The interesting thing with the Machen character is even before he gets a tryout, he seems to have, he seems to think of himself as sort of the LeBron James of rugby in that sense, but beforehand, and that he's not going to do anything unless he gets a contract up front without having shown anything. And then there's the interesting relationship he has with this older fellow who probably isn't a real scout. I don't know if they had talent scouts for the teams. The guy he calls Dad. So let's talk about the Frank character even before he becomes a rugby star. Is his background, I think you said, is more explored? Do we get a sense in the book, for example, of where that sort of arrogance is coming from?
Well, I think there's a few things. One is the relationship with his family, which is difficult. It's the relationship with his family, his mother and father, their dutiful, deferential relationship with authority, their desire to stay within their class. For him, he is kind of a little bit, well, in line with a lot of British New Wave protagonists, actually. He is breaking away from the conformity of his parents' generation and wants something else. And in a sense, he sees rugby as a shortcut to that something else. So that arrogance is driven by a desire to define himself as different. So this is this notion that I was talking about before of a collective understanding of the working class as homogenized, as mass, as everybody being like each other and no one sticking their head above the parapet and developing individualistic tendencies. Frank has that and wants that. He talks at great length about his worth, talks about his value as a sportsman, as an athlete. The other thing to think about here is that the film is really interested in exploring a particular kind of brutish, almost animalistic working class masculinity. And I think Stories does that throughout his work. He's interested in the sort of masochistic or sexual undertones of that as well. The homoerotic nature of that kind of those masculinities as well. They're much more ambiguous, and I think that's why Harris is perfect for the role, because of the way that he dominates physically the other characters, and we see the way that Anderson frames him as being almost the great ape on the rugby field, which is what he's described as, and that's manifested. So he is different, Dan, right? He's different from everybody else, and that is something that is quite revolutionary in British culture at the time, in British society, where people are told, and this is the thing with rugby as well, a team sport, but we're having someone acting as an individual within that, acting in quite a mercenary, with mercenary tendencies. So, yeah.
Let's talk about the sexuality in the film, because a lot of commenters that I was looking up for reviews and criticism of the film speak of the homoerotic nature of some of the bathroom scenes after matches, and yet Frank goes after a woman that has clearly got a lot of issues, that clearly rejects him on a number of occasions. And this, of course, a lot of people have commented very similarly how Machen is to Brando's character in A Streetcar Named Desire, going after the psychotic sister. And in both of those works of art, there's at least one scene. I've argued with a lot of people that in Streetcar Named Desire, if you actually read what Williams wrote, it's not a direct rape scene at the end. It's left ambiguously, but most people make it definitively rape. And some people have commented that there is a scene where it looks like Machen is forcing himself on Margaret Hammond, the widower. So you get the sense that Frank is somehow sexually insecure, and that a lot of this is a bravado. Let's talk about the sexual undertones here.
So I think that there is a degree of insecurity. There's also, I think, fundamentally an emotional inarticulacy.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that the film is really concerned with. I think as well there is a sense with Margaret, with Mrs. Hammond, that he cannot, that she is hard to get in some way, because she rejects him, because she, as you said, she's the one thing that he can't have. She represents something that he cannot acquire, and that drives his need for her. But there's also a sense of wanting to be mothered by her as well, and that conflation of kind of sexual and maternal desire, I think, is there too. I think the other element of sexuality to understand, or is through the lens of perhaps Lindsay Anderson's relationship with Richard Harris as an actor. So in Lindsay Anderson's diaries, he talks about the way that Richard Harris almost sexually bullied him, was aware that that Anderson desired him, and continually kind of flirted with him, and then mistreated him, and that the way that the camera, in a sense, is drawn to his physicality, his power, is, I think, reflected in Anderson's own relationship with Harris. And that's something that's confirmed by Story as well, in that he talks about this relationship between Anderson and Harris. So there's a kind of, there's something happening outside the text there as well. The other thing to talk through, as you mentioned, is the ambiguity of that rape scene. I think it is filmed, I think would be understood as a rape scene now. Looking at the stage directions for the more detailed screenplay, there is a degree of it's not discussed in that way, and a Story writes it as he writes sex between Margaret and Frank as something which Margaret lets him do as part of the condition of their relationship, in a sense. So it's much more ambiguous. Obviously, that ambiguity is very difficult to convey cinematically. I do think it's a kind of a deeply problematic element of the film, and certainly when I share it with with students now, they're also they struggle to understand what's going on there, and I think those ambiguities are quite open. And of course, the other element is the Weavers. So Mr. Weaver, the chairman, we see that close shot of his hand on the thigh of Frank, and there are similar allusions to his own sexuality. So there we've got a kind of conflation of a proprietorial economic relationship in that he's chairman and he owns Frank's body, but also one which manifests into a sexual relationship as well. So again, we've got that sense of ownership being about the body and what the body is. Is it an athletic body? Is it a sexualized body? Well, it's both of those things. And of course, Mrs. Weaver as well wants to acquire Frank as a sexual body.
Yeah.
The other thing I wanted to flag was the relationship between Frank and Morris, where who's his best friend, and we see the moment towards the end where Frank is really opening up, and it's one moment of emotional articulacy for Frank. We have a long take of Frank and Morris holding hands for a long time as the tears roll down Frank's face, and it's a moment of tenderness and fragile masculinity, which is quite revolutionary, really. I think for the period, particularly, and within the context of the film, where Frank has defined himself throughout as being a particular kind of man. Now, I think one of the great things about the film is that it says that narrative of masculinity is a prison, is the reason that Frank ultimately suffers, is the source, in a way, of his tragic decline, is his inability to see the limits of that narrative of masculinity. So, yeah, I think sexuality is really, really important as a way of understanding that.
Let's just talk a little bit about Rachel Roberts, who plays the love interest there. I couldn't imagine someone like Julie Christie, an actress who was big in the 60s, doing that kind of a role. She didn't seem, I mean, she's got more of that ethereal kind of beauty. Rachel Roberts has that kind of tough-looking demeanor, that she can be beautiful, but she can also really be a ball buster. And I think she works so well with Harris in that. Because of that. What was her background before this film and this role? Was she considered that kind of a woman to cast, or was this going against type for her?
So Carol Rice, the film producer, was the director of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which was a 1960 British New Wave film, which was probably the most successful and critically well regarded of the kitchen sink New Wave films. And in that film, she plays Albert Finney's older lover. She's a married lover. They have a very passionate sexual relationship, which contrasts with her married life to a member of the sort of docile, subservient, deferential working class community. The characters like Arthur Seaton in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and characters like Frank in Saturday Night and in This Sporting Life reject. So actually, there is an interesting continuity between these two kitchen sink roles for her. She's there's a certain intertextual relationship, I think, between them, in that she's playing an older lover. In the first one who's more liberated. In This Sporting Life, one who is almost overwhelmed by. I mean, she, in many ways, her death is an inevitability from the moment we see her. She's constantly in black. There is a kind of funereal mourning quality to her throughout. So, and I think in terms of Rachel Roberts, that also is quite significant in that she lived with depression herself, was an alcoholic, and was someone who went through periods of being very, very unwell and had her demons with her throughout. So I think that's important to note as well. She also develops a close working relationship with Lindsay Anderson after this film. You know, she appears in Oh Lucky Man in a particularly substantial role, and she's one of his kind of closest friends and confidants. She's, as you'll know, she's in a Picnic at Hanging Rock, the Peter Weir film as well. But yeah, she dies quite prematurely, really, as a result of her alcoholism. So she's a wonderful actor, but one who is haunted, I think, by the similar sorts of demons to Anderson, to Story, to Harris. They're all in a way carrying something within them, and that's also as a result of her class and her region. She's Welsh. That's the other thing to say, and she makes really no attempt to hide her Welsh accent. Similarly, Harris is Irish, and he makes very little attempt to hide his Irish accent. And yet our belief is suspended sufficiently to think that they're both in Yorkshire, which is a completely different part of the country. So I think it's a testament of both of their performance that they perform their own regional identity, their own background within the context of the Yorkshire setting. So that relationship is powerful. The other thing, Anderson rehearsed with the two of them in continuity, almost as a stage play. So built that relationship with them, very intense rehearsals before going on to location with them. So, yeah, and I think that really comes through in that very powerful final scene between the two of them. The rhythm of that is very theatrical, I would say.
Yeah, and her character is the one character that you probably feel sticks with Frank that much, because he seems to slough off Dad after the first third of the film. He seems to slough off being a star. He seems to slough off his friend Morris. He seems to everyone seems to fall away. And we get, I don't know how much time is supposed to have passed, a season or two by the end of the film, whatever you call a rugby, I guess it would be called a season. And by the end of the film, it seems like maybe a few years have passed, because his skills seem to have deteriorated. He's no longer this brute force. He seems to have been beaten down by the game, by life, that he's just another, great ape on the field.
Exactly that. And that's what the film looks at, I suppose, is interested in, is the finite, limited nature of his body, in a way. His body is a finite resource, and once it's spent, he has nothing. No. And if you define yourself purely in those terms, and yes, he does have that very confident sense of his own value, what we also see is the precarity of that. We see the limited temporary nature, and the older he gets, the slower he gets. He can no longer define himself in that way. So what does he have left? And that's where I think the film has so much interesting to say about sport, and the way that sport can be an instrument and a mechanism for understanding the pain of everyday life, really. The growing old, losing our value, losing our ability to contribute meaningfully, to attribute and attach value to the things that we do and the ways that we make sense of the world. If Frank defines himself solely through his performance on the rugby pitch, and if that is gone, what does he have? He has nothing. And that emptiness that we find at the end of the film is that culmination of that existential question that the film asks. And those slow motion scenes on the rugby pitch really vividly capture that sense of deterioration, that sense of loss, that sense of mourning. And to come back to David's story, this was something he himself was grappling with. Really these big questions of what is a meaningful life? Am I an artist? Am I a sportsman? Am I a writer? How can I be a son? How can I be a husband? When all these conflicting forces are pulling at him, and I think those conflicting forces are also represented in a character like Frank.
Now, this film was made almost 6 decades ago. When we talk about sports nowadays, oftentimes it's been seen as the thing that allows people from minority groups here in the U.S., certainly, and I would assume also in Europe, a way to ascend. I mean, LeBron James, if he talks, or like here at the Olympics as we're filming, Simone Biles is one of the greatest gymnasts. She's talking about her sexual abuse and using the Olympics as a stage for that. But back in that day, England was much less multicultural and class was much more dominant. The film seems to say that there's no way for Frank to win. He's not going to move up in station. He's just going to end up old, arthritic, and stooped. So what is the ultimate message of that film? That he's doomed?
Yes, I think he's doomed without an outlet. He's doomed without a mechanism to a level of emotional intelligence to be able to show his tenderness, to find an outlet for his tenderness. As I said, there's that moment with Morris where they're holding hands and he's crying, and we see something there, we see potential, we see, and there are obviously moments with Margaret where we also see his softer, his more tender side. I think in terms of sport, the film reminds us of the way that sport is in a capitalist society, and even then, where rugby league is kind of a hybrid form of amateur sport, in that players are paid, but they still would be undertaking their working class jobs at the same time. It's important to understand that rugby league was a kind of professional, was a semi-professional sport, while rugby union, played by more privileged, socially privileged people, was at the time an amateur sport, because people could afford to play that sport without being paid. So there's a whole class dimension to rugby. But to come back to your point about perhaps the comparison with America, we're seeing here, and this is the character of Weaver, sport reduces individual talent to a commodity. Frank, when he becomes aware, he's initially quite empowered by his awareness of himself as a commodity, feels he can use that, feels he can get somewhere with that. But actually it shows us that sport will chew you up and spit you out. That there'll be another Frank along, and once he's out, stayed his welcome, and his value is lost, he'll be moved along, and another person will come on the production line. Just like Mr. Weaver's, just like Margaret's husband, right? So it's really significant that Margaret's husband dies. There's a strong suggestion that he kills himself as a factory worker in one of Weaver's factories. Weaver owns the factory. Weaver also owns a sports club. Yeah. In both senses, we have these men who are exploited by him, and who ultimately are rejected by him, albeit in different ways. So sport as a kind of metaphor to understand those social relations, those economic conditions of relations, is really powerful here. And it actually takes me back to the person who wrote Kes, Barry Hines, because like David's story, he was a professional sportsman, he was an excellent sportsman. He was a footballer, had trials for Manchester United and things like that, and so similarly wrote about sport as a way of understanding the experience of class. So sport is hugely important in working class communities. Sport is much more important than other forms of popular culture. In England, I would say it's the central mechanism for meaning making, as you're talking about there, Simone Biles. One of the things that's been refreshing about that, I suppose, has been the way that, and we've seen similar things in the UK and in Europe, she's shown such a profound degree of candour and emotional intelligence, the ability to speak of the pain that she's experienced, both through sport and through the context in which sport operates, her mental health, right? Frank doesn't have that outlet. So I think the way that the film examines the intersections between sport, between physical and mental health, is fascinating and really carries a lot of wisdom for the way that we think about sport and health today.
Yeah, the film, that what I got was that sport, in a sense, is even crueler than just being a miner, because the miners know that they're going to get black lung, they're going to die, at least in that day and age, probably still today in most places around the world. But the sports, Frank is lured out by this sort of false promise that his life is going to be different. But by the end, when we see that final scene after he's been tackled and he's I think bleeding from the lip, and he gets up and he's in the mud, he's still as dirty. He's as dirty as any miner could be, and it's just been a delusion. And not only is there the possible idea that this whole film could be inside of his head, but even if it wasn't, he's still living another type of delusion.
You're absolutely right, Dan. You're absolutely right too, to draw the connections between the rugby pitch and the coal mine. In a way, the two things are interchangeable by the end of the film. Also, he's shown to be rejected by the class he aspires to be in. So think about the restaurant scene. You can have the nicest clothes, the nicest car, you can buy a fur coat, but all those superficial acquisitions are not enough to gain entry into the elite. He's rejected by them. He can't buy that. and that is a source of deep pain for him, because he also goes back to the estate. And remember, the woman who's looking after the kids when they go out for the meal, she's ashamed. She looks away when she sees Margaret wearing that fur coat, and she thinks that she shouldn't be doing that. So this is the thing of these two classes there. And then we also see later on where, you know, Frank falling between them. We see later on where his car has been, the kids are throwing stones at his car in the wasteland. He's living in what's called a kind of DOS house, you know, a temporary accommodation. The other two people in the screenplay, they're described as the Irishman and the Lithuanian. So these migrants who are in the town to work in temporary jobs, and Frank is lying in bed with them both. Even though he's in his expensive suit, he's living in this kind of temporary accommodation, surrounded by people who are really, in social terms, the lowest of the low. People who've been rejected and marginalised at the very margins of society. So it's a strange sense of displacement, and you're absolutely right about the cruelness of sport in accelerating that process of displacement and marginalisation for a character like Frank.
And it seems that almost everyone in the film, when they don't like something going their way, or they don't like, they look away. They don't want to deal with the reality. Margaret looks away many times when confronted with emotion. Dad looks away. A number of the characters in the sporting realm that he's in. But part of the most obvious scene is when Margaret's dying and there's the spider on the wall. The woman he says that he loves is dying, but instead of dealing with that, all he can do is sort of be like the Hulk. Hulk must smash. You know, boom, he bangs his fist and kills the spider right into the... And it's like no one wants to deal with the reality that they have in this film.
Yeah, and we have a saying in England, the stiff upper lip, yes. Kind of emotional constipation. And I don't think that's actually specific to a particular social class, because one thinks of a classic British film like The Brief Encounter, which is very much a middle-class film, which is all about the inability of a kind of national character trait, which is not to say how one feels. And I think what this film does is it explores the impacts and the implications of that level of emotional constipation, you know, where folk cannot say what is on their mind, cannot speak. And what happens when you can't speak is there are displacements that take place, violence, because you don't have a language comes to the fore. And this condition of a kind of toxic masculinity that comes through is a result of not having the language, not having the kind of ingredients, if you like, of emotional literacy, to the resources of emotional literacy to be able to say, I love you, or to be able to say, I care about you, or to be able to say, I feel like this, or I am depressed. And actually, you're absolutely right that in turning away, these characters are signalling, and the film does a great job of signalling the moments where they are failing to take the opportunity to have those intimate conversations, to actually be themselves. No one is themselves in this sporting life. And that's why I think the inner life is so important that we see through Frank. We see the insides of his consciousness in many ways, and I think that's one of the revolutionary elements of this film.
So, David, let me just sort of wind things up and then get to your recommendation as to why this is a great film. But one of the things that often in this film over the years, and it's been about 10 years since I first saw it, and I watched it 3 or 4 times since, people have regarded this often as Lindsay Anderson's best film and Richard Harris's best performance. And oddly, I'd say I have to agree on both scores. I mean, the first Anderson film I saw was the one where the kids take over the boarding school, with the guns. What was that one called?
If.
That's right. Yeah, that was the first one I saw. But then when I saw this, I was like, wow, this is so much deeper and richer. And Anderson, speaking of looking away, it's like Anderson never wanted to deal with reality as it is again in his films, as deeply as this. And secondly, with regards to Harris, I think he, after this, from what I've heard, he went off to do Major Dundee. And that's a film that I think really could have been a great film. It wasn't as well written as this film, but all the rest of his characters that I can think of, the major ones at least, uh, if you look at for example, Lawrence of Arabia with what's his face, that was his first major role. He went back and seemed to want to do deeper roles. But what was Harris just? So, I mean, why was it his choice? Did he make bad choices, or was he, typecast, or what?
That's a good question. I think there was something quite unique about the convergence of Harris' story and Anderson that created the conditions for this particular performance for Harris to be as you say, remarkable as it is. I think I've already alluded to the intensity of the relationship between Anderson and Harris. Harris's awareness of Anderson's desire for him and the way that he mined that as to convey the kind of sexual energy and charisma that Frank carries within him. But I also think, I would always say that in terms of Harris's relationship, I think class is really important in the sense that Story's relationship with Harris is defined through the lens of a kind of working class authenticity. That Harris is performing an identity which is so profoundly embedded in the pages of that screenplay and in the novel that it comes from, so authentically embedded, I should say, in the cultures of those locations. He's standing on that rugby pitch embodying centuries, in a sense, of masculine, working class, Northern English identity. So that realism of location, of reference, the authenticity of the story that Story is telling, I think, combined with Anderson's directing of Harris and, of course, Rachel Roberts as well, that creates the conditions for this to be a film that Harris excels in. And, of course, he moves, in and out of Hollywood after that point. And I think perhaps there is a less creative energy or choice or freedom in Hollywood in the period after this, and certainly that he, this is a moment in British culture which is quite fleeting, where you've got a first-time director, a first-time screenwriter, a relatively young, untested actor, making, for the time, quite a well-funded film with rank organisation, the studio. So that level of creativity is pretty unprecedented, and we'd never really see that creative power, if you like, afforded to people at that stage in their career in British cinema. So I think the conditions were just right. Also in alluding to what you were saying about this being Anderson's finest film, I would agree with you, Dan. I think that helps us to think through why this film is so significant. And again, I would emphasise the nature of collaboration here. We hear about this often as Lindsay Anderson's This Sporting Life. Auteurism, the tyranny of auteurism, I think is really problematic in this regard, because we can see here how his in the later choices he makes, in the films that he makes, like Britannia Hospital, If, and I Lucky Man, that kind of Brechtian, self-conscious rejection of realism, pursuing a kind of auteurist signature. But here he doesn't do that, because he's quite faithfully adapting this novel. He's working closely, and he's a close collaborator with Story. They work together on stage. They work together for TV, for an American TV production of In Celebration. They're close collaborators. But the stuff he does with Story is completely different to the stuff he goes on and does, such as If, such as Britannia Hospital, such as Lucky Man. I mean, it's very hard to draw connections between them. So this is I think collaboration is such a critical element of this film, and I can see a really fluid, symbiotic collaboration between actor, between director, between writer, also the cinematography on the film as well. Means that no one element dominates, and I think that's why the film is so beautifully balanced, and it's why this was the high point, really, for at least in cinematic terms for story, certainly for Harris as an actor, and I would absolutely say the same for story as a director.
You mean Anderson as a director, but
indeed.
That's not to say that Harris wasn't good. He was good in Red Desert, but that's a totally different character. He was a secondary character there, and he was much more internalized. But although there is that great sex scene that he has with Monica Vitti, where you can see their bodies, and it's a little bit reminiscent of the animality that he has in this role. But
yeah, and I also think that the dubbing, the Italian dubbing, I think creates a sort of otherworldly this point of distanciation with Harris there, which really reminds me of his reserve in certain moments in this sporting life. So I would say that's a good example, actually, Red Desert. And also Red Desert is an example too where he is making a creative choice, just like he did with This Sporting Life, or is making a choice which is motivated by an artistic desire rather than necessarily a commercial one. So yeah, I would agree that is a comparable film.
So, where would you put this film within the annals of kitchen sink dramas? And then let's end with why it's overall a great film that people today should still watch.
So, the thing I would say about kitchen sink dramas is that while there are continuities between those films, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to think of them as a coherent group of films almost made with an agenda, because they're very different. But I would say that This Sporting Life, Billy Liar, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and A Taste of Honey, of those films are the ones that absolutely stand out. So I would say it's comparable with those films, and probably marginally. I mean, I wouldn't want to get too much into saying one film is better than the other, but I feel quite strongly that This Sporting Life is a masterpiece. But I would also say, if you're going to look at this film, look at it next to Billy Liar, look at it next to A Taste of Honey, and look at it next to Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. They're all different, but they all touch on similar themes, and they all show us, I think, young actors, young working class actors, young filmmakers, and young writers. At a revolutionary moment in British culture. So certainly it's the darkest, the least commercial of those films, the most bereft of humour. And certainly it's the one that feels to me to be the least British in its sensibility. It feels like a much more of a mainland or continental European film in terms of its aesthetic. And then that's largely as a result of, as I say, that strange alchemy between stories, tendency towards existential themes in his films, and Anderson's cinephilic kind of absorption of Italian, French cinematic traditions. Why do I think this is a great film? It's almost an impossible question for me to answer because I'm so familiar with it, I struggle to get distance from it. But I think probably what we've been talking about how it examines the tragedy of emotional inarticulacy, and how it does that through the lens of class, sport, and also landscape and location and everyday life. It does that through an everyday vernacular. And I think those are so profoundly fundamental to how we continue to socially and culturally exist in Britain today. And also, I think, as you've said, there are particular similarities with how we might think about elements of American society in terms of class and masculinity and sport as well. So these are pretty fundamental elements of how we make meaning in kind of working class communities. And I think This Sporting Life really captures those quite powerfully. My students often talk to me when we were looking at all sorts of elements of realist cinema in Britain. They talk about the tyranny of kind of toxic masculinity that we find often in elements of British culture. I think this film also captures that and in many ways anticipates where that comes from and understanding what toxic masculinity is. So as a study in the limits and the reductive nature of particular forms of masculinity, I also think it is absolutely definitive, certainly in terms of British cinema. Those would be my particular points of distinction that I would like to emphasise about This Sporting Life.
Well, I want to thank you, David, for spending about an hour to speak about this great film. I will link to your university page below this YouTube video, and people can contact you if they want there. So again, thank you, David. It was a great talk.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I look forward to seeing it. And yeah, if any of your, any of your watchers, any of your followers want a follow-up conversation, please do encourage them to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to talk about this film and any related matters.